you found four elements that had to be satisfied to have a successful exit, as in, like, miss one of them and you're going to be unhappy. Can you talk about those?
I had to define what a good exit was. And I came up with, as you say, four things, or five.
4 plus 1 is the way I think about it.
4 plus 1, that's right, it's 4 plus 1. The first one was that people had gone through the process and felt the process was fair and that they had been received an appropriate amount of money for what they put into the business. The second one, the second characteristic of a good exit was that, which was really allowed by the first one, which was that they could look back on what they'd done and feel a sense of pride, knowing that they had built something and contributed something of value to the world. The third quality had to do with the other people who'd been on the journey with them, and that they felt at peace with what had happened to those people. That was going to be different for different people, obviously, but it was important that they be at peace with whatever it was. The fourth one was that they had figured out what they were going to do next and had become engaged in that. And for some people, there was the fifth one. Fifth one wasn't true for everyone, but it was true for a lot of people, was that they could, the company was going on and in fact doing better than ever. And, you know, which was really sort of an affirmation that they had done a good job on one of the most difficult transitions that any business has to go through. And so that was the fifth factor.
Before I read your book, I thought about exits as the exit, as like some kind of, I sign a piece of paper and I get a check and then like I'm done. Like a really narrow window of time.
An event.
An event, yeah.
Well, I thought that too. You know, as long as I'd been at Inc., I thought, yeah, okay, well, the exit is something that happens at the end, and it's an event. But as I really went in and interviewed people, I realized that that was the wrong way to look at it. That, in fact, the exit is a phase of the business. You know, you have the startup phase, you have the growth phase, you have the mature phase, and you have the exit phase. And that there are actually four stages to it. Or there should be 4 stages to it. The first stage is sort of the educational one, where you're basically just teaching yourself or learning what are the possibilities, and which, you know, what could it be, and which one would you prefer? The second one is the strategic phase. That's the stage where you're basically building into the company. You're building the company and you're building into it the qualities that are going to allow you to have the kind of exit you want. The third phase is the one that most people think of as the exit. And that's sort of begins when you call up your lawyer or your accountant, or you call up a broker or an investment banker and say, okay, I'm ready to sell. Can you find me a buyer? That stage ends with the deal. As far as all those other people are concerned, that's it. It's the check. You know, they get paid and they go on and do something else. But that's not the end for the entrepreneur. And this was key, because a lot of people don't realize this. Because, in fact, there's a fourth stage, which is the transition from being the owner of a business and being, you know, the head of the company and somebody whom other people look up to and want to, are sort of relying on for guidance and all kinds of other things. You go from that to being somebody whose phone calls don't get returned. And that can be a tremendously difficult period to go through.
In the book, you give 7 areas of advice for exiting entrepreneurs.
Right.
I really liked the one that you talked about first, which was start with knowing yourself in a nutshell. Can you talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's the same thing was true with Small Giants, actually. That was the first characteristic that I found with the people who built Small Giants, was they knew who they were, they knew what they wanted, and they knew why they wanted it. It's sort of not the sort of thing that you go off for a weekend and figure it out. Most of us spend our entire lives trying to figure that out. And oftentimes it takes very difficult experiences where we find out an awful lot about ourselves by going through very difficult experiences. But the people who know that almost all, have a much better chance of making decisions that they're going to be happy with later on. And, if you don't know that, you wind up doing what other people think you should do. And particularly when you go to sell your company or to move on in some way, everybody's going to have an opinion about what you should do. Everybody you talk to. And they'll be advising you about this, that, or the other thing. And it might or it might not be right to you. I would say, but the fact of the matter is that if you don't know that before you do the deal, you're gonna go run smack into it after you do the deal, because one of the first questions that comes up is, who am I? What's my purpose here? What's my identity? And a lot of people have to really struggle with that.
Give yourself time is another one of these 7. Yeah. And I got to ask, how much time? When do successful exits start?
Well, basically, when you look at the way that the exit process should go, if you're conscious about it, namely that there's this first period, the exploratory stage when you're figuring out what's involved. It's never too early to start that. Never. And I personally think that people are well advised to begin thinking about that as early as they think about going into business, frankly. It's certainly something that they should be thinking about after they get into business, because it's very easy, and it frequently happens, that people wind up making decisions in the early days of a business or in the course of growing the business that are going to severely restrict the ability, the choices that they're going to have at the end, particularly when it comes to equity. And, when you're building a business, you're often strapped and sort of worried about whether or not you're going to have enough money to pull off whatever plan it is and make payroll and so forth. And it's very tempting to give in to anybody who comes along offering you money. But the money always comes with strings attached. And if you're not really aware of what those strings are, you can wind up in a situation where, it'll be very sad. Yeah.
One of the things that you write about giving yourself time is the ability to correct a mistake in a succession decision.
Yeah.
And I found the stats on this depressing as hell
Yeah.
about how many people don't get it right the first time.
Well, basically, of all the companies I interviewed, there was one person who got it right the first time. And
One out of 100 plus.
whatever, yeah. And now I should add that, you know, not everybody I interviewed really needed a successor. They wound up selling to another company, which sort of absorbed them. So that if the kind of exit you want involves having a successor, it's frequently people make a lot of mistakes. It's the way it is.
So I've got one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that your seventh bit of advice, which is knowing what comes next,
Yeah, that's
I think about that as being pulled out by something new rather than merely stopping something you've done for years.
Well,
And I'd love you to talk more about that.
yeah, well, it's very difficult, as you can imagine. I mean, it would be very difficult for me when you're engaged in something that you enjoy doing to imagine what life is going to be like afterwards. It really involves visioning, which is the specialité of Zingerman's. And it's still very hard. And, you know, think about it. There was one guy who I talked to who took him 11 years to get to the point where he wasn't depressed anymore, and he actually had something else he was doing. And you think about it, you know, people say, a lot of people were saying to me that the worst question they could get after they sold their company was, what do you do? You know, they go to a party and somebody says, well, what do you do? And they wouldn't know how to answer. They didn't want to say, well, I used to own a company. And then the next question is, well, what do you do now? And it was very, so they lose that sense of identity. They lose the sense of purpose. You know, they lose their tribe, the people they've been hanging out with for years. They lose the structure that comes from business. Business is great because it tells you what you need to do next. And they lose the sort of the sense of accomplishment. Another thing about business that's great is that it tells you how you're doing, and it tells you what you're accomplishing. Suddenly you don't have any of that, and people feel lost. That's what they all say. They feel lost. It's like, and they're asking themselves, you know, who am I? What am I doing? Was I, you know, where do I go from here? And that can be profoundly depressing. I thought about it, and it was interesting, because when I looked at the people who'd had good exits, they often went through a rocky period in the beginning, but eventually what they wound up doing, a huge number of them, was helping other entrepreneurs, basically going into a business where they get paid to help entrepreneurs go through this process or go through building their companies. What are they doing? They're serving. And I thought, you know, when we say purpose, what are we talking about? We're really talking about who are you serving, you know? And in business, at the very least, you're probably serving your family. You're going to be serving your customers. If you aren't serving your customers, you're not going to be in business very long. For a lot of people, they're serving their employees as well. For a lot as well, here's Atomic Options are good. They're serving their community. And that really, the thing that people lose is that, or at least a lot of people, I can't say everybody because I didn't interview everybody, but for a lot of people, what they're losing is that sense of service, of who they're serving. They're just out there, and it's like, wait a minute, what am I doing? Who am I? And I think that that's really critical for people to think about beforehand.
Bo, thank you so much for writing Small Giants and inspiring us at Atomic, and then for Finish Big for inspiring me personally. Thanks very much.
Good. Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you all very much.